Sarah Martinez had always dreamed of flying, but her path to the cockpit wasn't the typical one. While other pilots came from military academies or expensive flight schools, Sarah started her career serving coffee and peanuts at 30,000 feet. She worked as a flight attendant for Delta Airlines for 8 years, watching pilots through the cockpit door and absorbing every conversation about weather patterns, flight plans, and emergency procedures. The other flight attendants thought she was crazy when she announced her plan to become a pilot. "Sarah, you're 32 years old," her supervisor Janet said during their break in the galley. "Most pilots start training in their 20s. And the cost? Girl, you're talking about spending your entire savings on something that might not even work out." But Sarah had been saving every penny from her salary and tips. She lived in a tiny studio apartment, drove a 15-year-old Honda Civic, and rarely went out to eat. While her colleagues spent their layovers shopping and sightseeing, Sarah visited flight training schools and studied aviation textbooks. She had calculated that she needed exactly $47,000 to complete her commercial pilot training, and after 3 years of extreme budgeting, she had saved $52,000. The day Sarah walked into Horizon Flight Academy in Phoenix, Arizona, the instructor looked at her application twice. "Ma'am, it says here you're currently working as a flight attendant?" he asked, adjusting his glasses. "That's unusual. Most of our students are either fresh out of college or transitioning from the military." "I know it's different," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "But I've been around aviation for 8 years. I understand aircraft systems, weather patterns, and emergency procedures better than most people starting flight school." The instructor, Captain Reynolds, was a former Air Force pilot with silver hair and skeptical eyes. "Understanding and doing are two very different things, Miss Martinez. Flying an aircraft requires split-second decisions, physical coordination, and mental toughness that you can't learn by watching from the cabin." Sarah's first few weeks at flight school were brutal. Her classmates were mostly young men in their early 20s, many with wealthy parents funding their aviation dreams. They had grown up playing flight simulator games and building model airplanes. During ground school, they would make subtle comments about her background. "Hey Sarah, when you become a pilot, will you still serve us coffee during the flight?" joked Marcus, a 23-year-old whose father owned a construction company. The other students laughed, and Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. But Sarah had something her classmates didn't have: real-world aviation experience. When they studied emergency procedures in textbooks, Sarah remembered actual emergencies she had witnessed. She recalled the time their Boeing 737 lost cabin pressure over Denver, and how the pilot's calm communication with air traffic control prevented panic among the passengers. She remembered the severe turbulence incident over the Rocky Mountains, where the pilot's smooth handling kept everyone safe while other passengers were terrified. Her first solo flight was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Captain Reynolds sat in the right seat as Sarah went through her pre-flight checklist on the small Cessna 172. Her hands were shaking slightly as she started the engine, but her voice was clear and confident as she communicated with ground control. "Horizon 847, requesting taxi clearance for runway 08 left," she spoke into her headset. "Horizon 847, taxi to runway 08 left via taxiway Alpha. Contact tower on 119.1. As Sarah taxied the small aircraft toward the runway, Captain Reynolds watched her carefully. He had trained hundreds of student pilots, and he could usually tell within the first few flights who had natural ability and who would struggle. Sarah's movements were deliberate and confident. She checked her instruments methodically, maintained perfect centerline control while taxiing, and her radio communications were crisp and professional. "Tower Horizon 847 ready for takeoff. Runway 08 left," Sarah transmitted. "Horizon 847. Cleared for takeoff runway 08 left. Fly runway heading. Maintain 3,000 feet." Sarah advanced the throttle smoothly, and the Cessna began rolling down the runway. At 65 knots, she gently pulled back on the yoke and the aircraft lifted off. The feeling of controlling an aircraft from the pilot's seat was completely different from being a passenger. Every input she made on the controls resulted in an immediate response from the aircraft. "Nice takeoff," Captain Reynolds said through the intercom. "Now let's see how you handle some basic maneuvers." For the next hour, Sarah practiced steep turns, stalls, and emergency procedures. Her years of watching professional pilots had given her an intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior. When Captain Reynolds asked her to perform a power-off stall, Sarah recognized the warning signs immediately: the decreasing airspeed, the mushy feeling in the controls, the slight buffeting that preceded the stall. "Recovering from stall," Sarah announced, pushing the yoke forward and adding power simultaneously. The aircraft responded perfectly, maintaining control throughout the maneuver. After landing, Captain Reynolds was unusually quiet as they walked back to the flight school building. Sarah was worried that she had made some critical error during the flight, but she couldn't think of what it might have been. "Sarah," he finally said as they reached the building, "I owe you an apology. When I first saw your application, I made assumptions about your ability based on your background. That was unfair and unprofessional of me." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, still unsure whether the flight had gone well or poorly. "In 32 years of flight instruction, I've rarely seen a student pilot with your natural ability and situational awareness. Your flight attendant experience didn't handicap you. It gave you advantages that most student pilots don't have. You understand how aircraft systems work together. You're comfortable with radio communications, and you have real-world experience with emergency procedures." Sarah felt a surge of pride and relief. "Thank you, Captain Reynolds. That means a lot coming from you." "Don't thank me yet," he said with a slight smile. "You still have a lot of training ahead of you, and I'm going to push you harder than any other student because I can see you have the potential to be an exceptional pilot." Over the following months, Sarah threw herself into her training with fierce determination. She studied aircraft systems until she could diagram every component from memory. She practiced radio communications in her car during her commute. She spent hours in the flight simulator, practicing emergency procedures until her responses became automatic. Her classmates gradually began to respect her dedication and skill. Marcus, who had made the coffee joke during her first week, approached her after a particularly challenging navigation flight. "Sarah, I have to admit something," he said, looking slightly embarrassed. "I thought you were crazy for starting pilot training at your age with your background. But you're the best pilot in our class and probably the hardest working person I've ever met. I'm sorry for giving you a hard time in the beginning." "Thanks, Marcus," Sarah replied. "We're all here for the same reason, because we love aviation. That's what matters." As Sarah progressed through her training, she began to realize that her unconventional path to the cockpit had given her unique strengths. Her customer service experience made her excellent at communicating with passengers and crew. Her years of observing professional pilots had taught her the importance of remaining calm under pressure, and her maturity gave her better judgment than many younger pilots who were technically skilled but lacked real-world experience. After 18 months of intensive training, Sarah earned her commercial pilot license and instrument rating. But finding her first job as a pilot proved to be another challenge entirely. The major airlines required thousands of flight hours that she didn't have, and most regional airlines were hiring pilots with military backgrounds or college aviation degrees. Sarah applied to 43 different aviation companies over 3 months. She received 37 rejection letters and 6 interviews that led nowhere. The feedback was always polite but devastating. "We're looking for candidates with more traditional backgrounds," or "we prefer pilots with 4-year degrees," or simply, "we've decided to go with other candidates." Her savings were running dangerously low, and she was beginning to wonder if Janet had been right about her crazy dream. She was sitting in her studio apartment one evening, eating instant noodles and reviewing her dwindling bank account, when her phone rang. "Is this Sarah Martinez?" asked a gruff voice on the other end. "Yes, this is Sarah. This is Tom Bradley from Life Flight Medical Services. I got your resume from Captain Reynolds at Horizon Flight Academy. He says you're the best pilot he's trained." "In years and that you have some kind of medical background?" Sarah's heart jumped. "Well, not medical exactly. I was a flight attendant for 8 years. I'm trained in CPR, first aid, and emergency medical procedures. I've assisted with several in-flight medical emergencies. Can you be here tomorrow morning at 7 for an IE interview? We need pilots who can handle medical emergencies and work under pressure. Fair warning, though, this isn't glamorous flying. We operate in all kinds of weather, often to remote locations and sometimes in dangerous situations." Sarah didn't hesitate. "I'll be there." Life Flight Medical Services operated from a small hangar at the regional airport. The company provided emergency medical transport throughout the Southwest, flying critically injured patients from remote areas to major hospitals. When Sarah arrived for her interview, She was surprised by how different it felt from the sterile, corporate offices of the airlines where she had interviewed previously. The hangar was bustling with activity. Paramedics were loading medical equipment into a twin-engine aircraft while pilots reviewed weather reports and flight plans. Everyone moved with urgent purpose, and Sarah could sense the life-or-death nature of their work. Tom Bradley was a former military helicopter pilot, with weathered hands and intense blue eyes. He had started life flight 15 years earlier, after his own daughter's life was saved by a medical transport flight. During the interview, he asked Sarah unusual questions that had nothing to do with her flight training. "Tell me about a time when you had to make a quick decision under pressure," he said, leaning back in his chair. Sarah thought for a moment. 3 years ago, I was working a flight from Phoenix to Chicago when a passenger went into cardiac arrest 30 minutes before landing. The flight attendant protocol is to call for medical professionals among the passengers and notify the flight crew, but there were no doctors on board, and the passenger had stopped breathing. "What did you do?" "I started CPR immediately while my colleague contacted the cockpit. I continued chest compressions for 22 minutes while the pilot diverted to the nearest airport. The paramedic said later that my quick action and continuous CPR saved the man's life. He made a full recovery." Tom nodded approvingly. Most flight attendants would have panicked or waited for someone else to take charge. You took responsibility for a life-threatening situation and followed through until help arrived. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need in our pilots. "I've always believed that when someone's life is in danger, you do whatever it takes to help them," Sarah replied. "Our pilots don't just fly the aircraft," Tom explained. "They're part of the medical team. You might need to help load a critical patient, assist with medical equipment, or make split-second decisions about weather and landing sites that could mean the difference between life and death. Are you prepared for that kind of responsibility?" Sarah looked directly into his eyes. "I've spent 8 years taking care of passengers at 35,000 feet. I know what it means to be responsible for people's safety and well-being. I'm ready for whatever challenges this job brings." Tom hired her on the spot. Sarah's first week at Life Flight was overwhelming. She had to learn the medical equipment, study the locations of every hospital and landing site within their service area, and master the complex logistics of coordinating with emergency responders, hospitals, and air traffic control simultaneously. Her partner was Jake Morrison, a paramedic with 12 years of experience who had seen everything from car accidents to natural disasters. Jake was initially skeptical about working with a former flight attendant, but his attitude changed after their first mission together. The call came in at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. A rancher in rural New Mexico had been crushed by a bull and was bleeding internally. The nearest trauma center was 180 miles away, and ground transport would take over 4 hours. The patient would likely die without immediate surgical intervention. Sarah and Jake were airborne within 8 minutes of receiving the call. The weather was marginal: low clouds, gusty winds, and scattered thunderstorms in the area. The landing site was a gravel road next to the ranch house, with no runway lights or ground support. As they flew through the darkness, Jake briefed Sarah on the patient's condition. 34-year-old male, possible internal bleeding, blood pressure dropping, conscious but weak. The local EMTs have started an IV and are giving him fluids, but he needs surgery within the next 2 hours or he's not going to make it. Sarah studied the GPS coordinates and weather radar on her instruments. "We've got a line of thunderstorms between us and the pickup site. I can navigate around them, but it'll add 15 minutes to our flight time." "Can we go through them instead of around?" Jake asked. Sarah shook her head. "Too dangerous. The turbulence could worsen his injuries and we might encounter severe icing or hail. The extra 15 minutes is worth the safer flight." When they arrived at the ranch, Sarah had to land on the narrow, gravel road in complete darkness, guided only by the headlights of 2 pickup trucks. The crosswind was gusting to 25 knots, right at the edge of the aircraft's limitations. Life Flight 602, winds are 270 at 20, gusting 25, the local EMT reported over the radio. Sarah lined up her approach carefully, compensating for the crosswind with practiced precision. The aircraft touched down smoothly on the rough surface, and she quickly shut down the engine so Jake could load the patient. The injured rancher was conscious but pale, with obvious signs of internal bleeding. His wife was crying as the paramedics transferred him to the aircraft's stretcher system. "Is he going to be okay?" she asked Sarah as they prepared for takeoff. Sarah took the woman's hand gently. "We're taking him to the best trauma center in the state. Our team will monitor him constantly during the flight, and he'll be in surgery within an hour. You did the right thing calling us." During the flight to the hospital, the patient's condition began to deteriorate. His blood pressure dropped dangerously low, and Jake had to start a second IV line and administer emergency medications. "Sarah, we need to get there faster," Jake said urgently. "His blood pressure is crashing." Sarah immediately contacted air traffic control. "Albuquerque approach. Life Flight 602 requesting priority handling and direct routing to University Hospital. We have a critical patient on board." Life Flight 602. Cleared direct University Hospital. Maintain 8,000 feet. Emergency medical services standing by. Sarah pushed the aircraft to its maximum cruise speed while maintaining a smooth flight to avoid jostling the patient. She coordinated with the hospital's landing zone controller and had the aircraft on the ground within 43 minutes of takeoff. The trauma team was waiting as they landed. Jake and the hospital staff transferred the patient to the emergency room in less than 2 minutes, and Sarah watched the ambulance speed away toward the hospital entrance. Later, Jake found Sarah in the hangar completing her post-flight paperwork. "I owe you an apology," he said. "When Tom told me he was hiring a former flight attendant as a pilot, I figured you'd be okay for routine transports but might not handle the pressure when things got serious." Sarah looked up from her logbook. "And now? Now I know you're exactly the kind of pilot this job needs. Your decision-making tonight was perfect. You chose safety over speed on the approach. You handled that crosswind landing like a veteran, and you got us to the hospital as fast as possible without compromising patient care." The doctor said another 20 minutes and that rancher would have died. Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction that was different from anything she had experienced as a flight attendant. She had used her flying skills to directly save someone's life, and it felt like she had finally found her true calling in aviation. Over the next 2 years, Sarah established herself as one of Life Flight's most reliable pilots. She flew through thunderstorms, sandstorms, and blizzards to reach patients in remote locations. Her logbook filled with stories of successful missions: heart attack victims airlifted from mountain hiking trails, car accident survivors transported from desert highways, and premature babies flown from small-town hospitals to neonatal intensive care units. But Sarah's unconventional background continued to create challenges in unexpected ways. The broader aviation community, particularly military pilots and airline captains, often viewed medical transport pilots as second-tier aviators who couldn't get real flying jobs. This attitude became painfully clear during a regional aviation safety conference in Denver. Sarah was attending a seminar on emergency procedures when she found herself sitting next to Captain David Walsh, a former Navy pilot who now flew for a major airline. "So what do you fly?" Captain Walsh asked during a break between presentations. "I'm a pilot with Life Flight Medical Services," Sarah replied. "We do emergency medical transport throughout the Southwest." Captain Walsh's expression changed noticeably. "Oh, you're one of those helicopter pilots," he said dismissively. "Actually, I fly fixed-wing aircraft, King Air 350s mostly," Sarah corrected. "Still, medical transport is basically a taxi service, isn't it? I mean, how challenging can it be to fly patients from point A to point B? It's not like you're dealing with combat situations or complex airline operations." Sarah felt her temper rising but kept her voice calm. "We operate in all weather conditions to locations that often don't have control towers, runway lights, or ground support. Many of our landing sites are unpaved strips or roads in remote areas. We have to coordinate with multiple emergency agencies while making life or death decisions about patient care and flight safety." "That's nice," Captain Walsh said condescendingly, "but it's still not real airline flying. When you're responsible for 300 passengers on a transatlantic flight, dealing with multiple system failures and severe weather, then you'll understand what professional aviation is really about." Before Sarah could respond, the seminar resumed, but Captain Walsh's words stung. Despite her proven track record and life-saving missions, she was still viewed as an outsider by many in the aviation community. That evening, Sarah called her mentor Captain Reynolds to vent her frustration. "Sarah, you can't let the attitudes of others define your self-worth," he advised. I've been in aviation for over 40 years, and I've seen pilots from every background imaginable. Some of the best aviators I've known came from unconventional paths, and some of the worst had all the right credentials on paper. But it bothers me that they think what I do isn't real flying. Sarah admitted. What you do is more real than most flying, Captain Reynolds said firmly. You're not just operating an aircraft, you're saving lives. Every decision you make has immediate consequences for the people counting on you. That takes a special kind of pilot, and not everyone can handle that pressure. Sarah's confidence was restored, but the encounter with Captain Walsh reminded her that she would always have to work harder to prove herself in the aviation world. 3 months later, Sarah faced her most challenging mission yet. The call came in on a Friday evening during monsoon season. A tourist helicopter had crashed in the mountains near the Arizona-Mexico border. 3 survivors were critically injured and stranded in terrain too dangerous for ground rescue teams to reach before morning. The weather conditions were severe: thunderstorms, high winds, and low visibility. The crash site was at 8,500 feet elevation on a narrow ridge with no suitable landing area nearby. Several other medical transport companies had declined the mission due to the dangerous conditions. Tom Bradley briefed Sarah and Jake personally before the flight. "I won't order you to take this mission," he said. "The weather is marginal, the terrain is hostile, and there are 3 lives hanging in the balance. It's your call, Sarah." Sarah studied the weather reports and topographical maps carefully. The crash site was in mountainous terrain with rapidly changing weather patterns. The survivors were located on a ridge that could only be approached from one direction due to the surrounding peaks. "What's the latest weather at the crash site?" she asked. "Winds gusting to 35 knots, visibility 3 miles in rain showers, ceiling at 9,000 feet, Tom reported. "The National Weather Service is forecasting conditions to worsen over the next 2 hours. Sarah looked at Jake, who had been unusually quiet during the briefing. "What do you think?" Jake had worked with Sarah on dozens of missions and trusted her judgment completely. "If you think we can get in there safely, I'm with you. Those people need help, and we might be their only chance." Sarah made her decision. "We'll take the mission. But if conditions deteriorate beyond safe limits at any point, we turn around immediately. No patient is worth creating more casualties." The flight to the crash site took 90 minutes through increasingly rough weather. Sarah had to deviate around several thunderstorms, adding time and fuel burn to their mission. As they approached the mountains, the turbulence became severe. "Life Flight 602, this is Border Patrol Helicopter 341, came a voice over the radio. "We attempted to reach the crash site 30 minutes ago but had to turn back due to severe downdrafts and wind shear. Conditions are extremely dangerous." Sarah acknowledged the transmission and continued her approach. She had studied the terrain extensively and identified a small clearing about half a mile from the crash site where she might be able to land. The survivors would need to be transported to the aircraft by ground rescue personnel using ropes and climbing equipment. As they neared the crash site, Sarah could see the wreckage of the tourist helicopter scattered across a rocky slope. 3 figures were visible near the debris, waving frantically at their aircraft. "I can see the survivors," Jake reported. "Looks like they're conscious and mobile, which is good news." Sarah began her approach to the clearing she had identified on the maps. The winds were gusting unpredictably, and she had to make constant corrections to maintain her approach path. The aircraft was being tossed around violently by the turbulence. "Ground rescue team, this is Life Flight 602, Sarah transmitted. "I'm beginning my approach to the clearing. Have your team ready to move as soon as I'm on the ground. Life Flight 602, we're ready. Be advised that we're seeing wind gusts up to 40 knots at the surface." Sarah lined up her final approach, fighting the controls as wind shear pushed the aircraft around. The clearing was smaller than it had appeared on the maps, with tall trees on both sides and a steep slope at the far end. At 50 feet above the ground, a sudden downdraft slammed the aircraft toward the trees. Sarah immediately added power and executed a go-around, climbing away from the terrain. "That was close," Jake said, his voice tight with tension. Sarah circled the area, studying the wind patterns and looking for alternative landing sites. The weather was continuing to deteriorate, and she knew they only had 1 or 2 more approach attempts before conditions became too dangerous to continue. "I'm going to try a different approach angle," she announced. "The wind seems to be more stable from the northeast." Her second approach was smoother until the final moments. As the aircraft descended through 50 feet, Another downdraft caught them, but this time Sarah was ready. She immediately lowered the nose and added power, using her airspeed to counter the downdraft. The aircraft touched down hard on the uneven ground, bouncing twice before settling. Sarah quickly shut down the engines and secured the aircraft while Jake prepared the medical equipment. The ground rescue team reached them within 10 minutes, carrying the first survivor on a stretcher. The patient was a young woman with a broken leg and possible internal injuries. She was conscious but in severe pain. As Jake worked to stabilize the patient, the rescue team brought the second survivor, a man with a head injury and broken ribs. The third survivor, an older woman, had a suspected spinal injury and required extremely careful handling during transport. Loading all 3 patients into the aircraft took 25 minutes, during which the weather conditions continued to worsen. Sarah watched the wind indicators nervously, knowing that takeoff in these conditions would be even more challenging than landing. With all patients secured, Sarah started the engines and prepared for departure. The clearing that had seemed barely adequate for landing now felt impossibly small for takeoff, especially with the added weight of 3 passengers and medical equipment. The takeoff from the mountain clearing was the most technically challenging flying Sarah had ever attempted. The aircraft was at maximum weight. The density altitude was high due to the elevation and temperature, and the gusty winds created unpredictable conditions. She would have only one chance to get it right. Sarah carefully calculated her takeoff performance, accounting for the weight, altitude, temperature, and wind conditions. The numbers were marginal. She would need every foot of the clearing and perfect technique to get airborne safely. "Everyone secure back there?" She called to Jake, who was monitoring the 3 injured patients. "We're ready," Jake replied. "The woman with the spinal injury is stable, but we need to get her to the hospital as soon as possible. The head injury patient is showing signs of increased intracranial pressure." Sarah advanced the throttles slowly, feeling the aircraft begin to roll forward on the rough ground. The heavily loaded aircraft accelerated sluggishly, and she could see the trees at the end of the clearing growing larger through the windscreen. At 60 knots, she gently pulled back on the yoke, but the aircraft wasn't ready to fly yet. At 65 knots, she could feel the wings beginning to generate lift, but they still needed more speed. 70 knots. The aircraft was getting light on its wheels, but still not airborne. The trees were now filling the windscreen, and Sarah realized they weren't going to clear them with a normal takeoff. In that split second, Sarah made a decision that would either save their lives or end them. Instead of aborting the takeoff, she pushed the yoke forward slightly, keeping the aircraft on the ground to build more speed. At the very last moment, she pulled back firmly on the controls and the aircraft leaped into the air, clearing the treetops by less than 10 feet. "Jesus, Sarah," Jake exclaimed from the back. That was incredible flying. But their troubles weren't over yet. The aircraft was climbing slowly in the thin mountain air, and Sarah could see another line of severe thunderstorms directly ahead of their route to the hospital. "Albuquerque Center. Life Flight 602 requesting deviation around weather," Sarah transmitted. "Life Flight 602 approved as requested. Be advised we're showing extreme precipitation and turbulence in your area. Several aircraft have reported severe turbulence and requested deviations." Sarah studied her weather radar and realized that the storm system had grown larger and more intense since their departure. The thunderstorms now blocked their direct route to the hospital, and deviating around them would add 30 minutes to their flight time. "Jake, what's the status on our patients?" she asked. "The spinal injury is stable, but I'm concerned about the head trauma patient. His pupils are becoming unequal, which indicates increasing brain pressure. He needs surgery within the next hour, or he could suffer permanent brain damage or death." Sarah was faced with an impossible choice. Flying through the thunderstorms could kill all of them, but deviating around the weather might cost the head injury patient his life. She had to find a third option. Studying her charts and weather radar, Sarah identified a narrow gap between 2 thunderstorm cells. The gap was only about 5 miles wide and would require precise navigation to fly through safely, but it would save 20 minutes compared to the long deviation. "I'm going to thread the needle between these 2 storm cells," she announced. "It's going to be rough, but it's our best chance to get the head injury patient to the hospital in time." Sarah turned toward the gap between the thunderstorms, monitoring her weather radar continuously. The turbulence increased dramatically as they approached the storm system, and the aircraft began bouncing violently. How are the patients handling this? Sarah called back to Jake. They're secured, but the woman with the spinal injury is in a lot of pain from the turbulence. I'm trying to keep her as stable as possible. As they entered the gap between the storm cells, the turbulence became severe. The aircraft was being thrown around so violently that Sarah had to grip the controls with both hands to maintain control. Rain hammered against the windscreen, and occasional lightning illuminated the dark clouds surrounding them. Life Flight 602. Radar shows you're flying between two Level 5 thunderstorm cells. Air traffic control transmitted. Are you experiencing severe turbulence? Affirmative, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the aircraft being tossed around like a toy. We have a critical head injury patient who needs immediate surgery. We're accepting the turbulence to minimize flight time. For 8 terrifying minutes, Sarah flew through the narrow corridor between the thunderstorms. Her instrument training proved invaluable as she maintained precise heading and altitude control, despite the severe turbulence and limited visibility. Finally, they emerged from the storm system into clearer air. The turbulence decreased dramatically, and Sarah could see the lights of Albuquerque in the distance. University Hospital, Life Flight 602 inbound with 3 critical patients from helicopter crash. ETA 8 minutes. Life Flight 602 trauma team standing by. Weather at the hospital is wind 280 at 15 knots. Visibility 10 miles. Ceiling 3,000 feet. The landing at University Hospital was routine compared to what they had just experienced. Sarah touched down smoothly on the hospital's helipad, and the trauma team was waiting with stretchers as she shut down the engines. The 3 patients were rushed into the emergency room, and Sarah watched them disappear through the hospital doors. She wouldn't know their outcomes until later, but she knew they had given all 3 survivors the best possible chance for recovery. Jake found Sarah in the pilot's lounge an hour later, where she was completing her flight reports and trying to decompress from the intense mission. I just talked to the trauma surgeon, he said, sitting down across from her. All 3 patients are going to make it. The spinal injury patient will need surgery but should have a full recovery. The woman with the broken leg is already in stable condition. And the head trauma patient, the surgeon said another 15 minutes and he would have suffered irreversible brain damage. Your decision to fly through that storm gap saved his life. Sarah felt a wave of relief and satisfaction wash over her. Despite the dangerous conditions and technical challenges, they had successfully completed the mission and saved 3 lives. You know what the best part is? Jake continued. I overheard 2 of the hospital trauma surgeons talking about our flight. They said it was the most skilled flying they'd ever seen in 20 years of working with medical transport crews. But Sarah's moment of triumph was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Captain David Walsh, the airline pilot who had dismissed her work at the aviation conference, appeared in the doorway of the pilot's lounge. Ms. Martinez? I'm David Walsh. I believe we met at the Denver Aviation Conference a few months ago. Sarah looked up, surprised to see him. Yes, I remember. What are you doing here? Captain Walsh looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. I was deadheading on a commercial flight that was diverted here due to the storms. I heard about your rescue mission tonight from some of the hospital staff and I wanted to talk to you. About what? About eating my words, he said quietly. I was wrong about medical transport flying, and I was wrong about your capabilities as a pilot. What you did tonight, flying into those mountains in severe weather, landing in that impossible clearing, threading the gap between those thunderstorms, that takes more skill and courage than anything I do flying passengers on scheduled routes. Sarah was stunned by his admission. Thank you for saying that. I've been flying for 25 years and I wouldn't have attempted half of what you did tonight. I owe you an apology for my comments at the conference. Medical transport pilots like you are the real heroes in aviation. After Captain Walsh left, Sarah sat quietly in the lounge, reflecting on the evening's events. She thought about her journey from serving coffee at 30,000 feet to saving lives in some of the most challenging flying conditions imaginable. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Captain Reynolds. Heard about your rescue mission tonight through the aviation grapevine. Sounds like you handled yourself like the exceptional pilot I always knew you could be. Proud of you, Sarah. News of Sarah's heroic mountain rescue spread quickly through the aviation community. Local news stations picked up the story, and aviation magazines featured articles about the dramatic mission. Sarah received calls from other medical transport companies offering her positions, and even some airlines expressed interest in hiring her. But Sarah was content at life flight. She had found her calling in emergency medical aviation, and the recognition felt good after years of proving herself. However, her biggest challenge was yet to come. 6 months after the mountain rescue, international. Tensions escalated dramatically when a humanitarian crisis erupted in the fictional nation of Valeria, a small country in Eastern Europe. Civil war had broken out between government forces and rebel groups, creating a massive refugee crisis. Thousands of civilians were trapped in the capital city of Petrograd, which was under siege by rebel forces. The International Red Cross launched an emergency humanitarian mission, requesting volunteer pilots to fly medical evacuation flights from the conflict zone. The missions would involve flying into an active war zone, landing at airports under sporadic artillery fire, and evacuating critically wounded civilians and aid workers. Most commercial pilots immediately declined to participate. The insurance liability alone made it nearly impossible for regular airlines to approve such missions. Military pilots were restricted by their governments from participating in what was technically a civilian humanitarian operation. When Tom Bradley received the request from the Red Cross, he called a meeting with all of Life Flight's pilots to discuss the volunteer opportunity. The conference room was unusually quiet as he explained the mission parameters. They need experienced pilots who can operate in hostile environments and handle medical emergencies simultaneously, Tom explained. The flights would involve landing at Petrograd International Airport, loading wounded refugees and flying them to safety in neighboring countries. The airport is still technically operational, but it's within artillery range of rebel positions. Several pilots immediately expressed concerns about the danger. "Tom, this isn't what we signed up for," said Mike Torres, a veteran pilot with 15 years at Life Flight. "We take calculated risks to save lives, but flying into an active war zone is suicide." "I understand everyone's concerns," Tom replied. "This is completely voluntary, and no one will be penalized for declining. But the Red Cross estimates that over 3,000 wounded civilians are trapped in the city, including many children who will die without immediate medical evacuation." Sarah listened to the discussion while studying the mission briefing documents. The flights would use specially configured aircraft with Red Cross markings, operating under international humanitarian law protection. However, that protection was only theoretical. If rebel forces decided to target medical aircraft, there would be little anyone could do to stop them. "What kind of support would we have?" Sarah asked. "Minimal," Tom admitted. "The international community is providing diplomatic protection and communication support, but essentially you'd be on your own once you cross into Valerian airspace. The government forces controlling the airport can provide basic ground support, but they're under constant attack themselves." The room fell silent as everyone contemplated the risks. Flying into a war zone was far beyond anything they had trained for, and the potential consequences were severe. "I'll do it," Sarah said quietly. Every head in the room turned toward her. "Sarah, are you sure?" Tom asked. "This is incredibly dangerous, and you have no military experience." "I didn't have medical transport experience when you hired me either," Sarah replied. "But I learned because people needed help. These refugees don't care about my background, they just need someone willing to fly them to safety." Mike Torres shook his head. "Sarah, this isn't like our mountain rescues or storm flights. There are people actively trying to kill anyone who enters that airspace. This is way beyond what civilian pilots should be doing." Sarah understood his concerns, but she couldn't get the images of wounded children out of her mind. "Every mission we fly is about saving lives. This is just a bigger scale. If no civilian pilots volunteer, those people will die waiting for help that never comes." Jake Morrison, who had been Sarah's partner on dozens of missions, spoke up. "If Sarah's going, I'm going with her. We work well as a team, and those refugees are going to need experienced medical support during the evacuation flights." Tom looked around the room one more time. "Anyone else?" The other pilots remained silent. Sarah didn't blame them. They all had families and responsibilities, and the mission was extremely dangerous. But she felt compelled to help, despite the risks. "All right then," Tom said. "Sarah and Jake, you'll represent Life Flight in the Red Cross humanitarian mission. I'll handle the insurance and legal issues. You leave for Europe in 3 days. After the meeting, several of her colleagues approached Sarah privately to express their concerns. Sarah, I admire your courage, but this mission could be a death sentence, warned Linda Chen, one of the senior pilots. You're not a military pilot. You don't have combat training or experience with hostile environments. I've been flying in challenging conditions for 3 years now, Sarah replied. Weather, terrain, mechanical problems, I've handled them all. This is just another type of challenge. But this time people are going to be shooting at you, Linda said bluntly. That's a completely different level of danger. Sarah spent the next 3 days studying everything she could about flying in combat zones. She read military aviation manuals, watched training videos, and spoke with former military pilots about defensive flying techniques. She learned about threat recognition, evasive maneuvers, and emergency procedures for aircraft damaged by enemy fire. The night before her departure, Sarah called her parents to explain what she was doing. Her mother cried when she heard about the mission, begging Sarah to reconsider. Mija, you've already proven yourself as a pilot, her mother said through tears. You don't need to risk your life in a war zone. Let someone else do this. Mom, there is no one else, Sarah explained gently. The military pilots can't go because of political restrictions, and the airline pilots won't go because it's too dangerous. If Jake and I don't do this mission, those wounded people will die. Her father, who had always been proud of Sarah's aviation career, was more understanding. Your mother and I are terrified for you, but we know you have to follow your conscience. Just promise me you'll be careful and come home safely. I promise, Dad. I'll be as careful as possible while still getting the job done. The flight to Europe took 14 hours, with stops for fuel and customs clearance. Sarah and Jake traveled in a specially modified King Air 350 equipped with additional medical equipment and communication systems. The aircraft had been painted with large Red Cross symbols and medical markings to identify it as a humanitarian flight. Upon arriving in Budapest, Hungary, they met with Red Cross officials and other volunteers who would be supporting the evacuation missions. The briefing was sobering. Satellite imagery showed extensive damage to Petrograd, with several neighborhoods completely destroyed by artillery bombardment. The airport is still operational, but barely, explained Dr. Elena Vasquez, the Red Cross mission coordinator. The main runway has some shell damage, but it's still usable. The terminal building has been hit several times, but the government forces have set up a temporary medical facility in one of the hangars. Sarah studied aerial photographs of the airport, noting the damaged areas and identifying potential hazards. What's the security situation around the airport? Government forces control the immediate airport area, but rebel positions are less than 2 miles away. They have artillery and possibly surface-to-air missiles, though they haven't targeted medical flights yet. However, there's always a risk that could change. The mission plan called for quick turnaround flights, land, load patients, and depart as rapidly as possible to minimize exposure to enemy fire. Each flight would carry up to 6 critically wounded patients, with priority given to children and pregnant women. Remember, Dr. Vasquez emphasized, you're protected under international humanitarian law, but that protection only works if both sides respect it. If the situation deteriorates, you need to abort the mission immediately. No patient is worth creating more casualties. As Sarah sat in the cockpit after the engines were shut down, she realized that her hands were trembling uncontrollably. The stress of flying a damaged aircraft while under enemy fire had pushed her to the absolute limits of her capabilities. You okay? Jake asked, appearing in the cockpit doorway. I think so, Sarah replied, trying to steady her hands. That was the closest I've ever come to losing an aircraft. You saved 8 lives today, 7 patients plus that baby. I've never seen flying like that in my entire career. You kept that damaged aircraft in the air through sheer skill and determination. But their most dangerous mission was still ahead of them. On their 15th day in Europe, Sarah and Jake received an urgent request that would test every skill they had developed over their years of emergency medical flying. A group of international journalists and aid workers had been trapped in a hospital in the besieged city of Mikhailovsk, 30 miles north of the capital. The hospital had been treating wounded civilians when rebel forces surrounded the area, cutting off all ground evacuation routes. Among the trapped individuals was Dr. Robert Chen, a renowned American surgeon who had been operating on war casualties for the past week. Dr. Chen had suffered a severe heart attack during surgery and needed immediate cardiac intervention that wasn't available in the war zone. Without emergency transport to a major medical facility, he would die within hours. The problem was that Mikhailovsk had no airport. The only possible landing site was a straight section of highway about a mile from the hospital, but it was within range of rebel artillery positions and had never been used for aircraft operations. This mission is completely voluntary, Dr. Vasquez explained during the briefing. The road landing site is unimproved, surrounded by enemy forces, and we have no ground support available. It would be the most dangerous mission of the entire humanitarian operation. Sarah studied the satellite images of the proposed landing site. The highway was straight and wide enough for the King Air, but it was flanked by dense forest where enemy troops could be hiding. There were no lights for night operations, and the surface condition was unknown. "What's the latest intelligence on enemy positions?" Sarah asked. "Rebel forces control the forest on both sides of the highway, and they have artillery positions within 3 miles of the landing site. However, they've agreed to a temporary ceasefire for humanitarian evacuation, though we don't know how reliable that agreement is." Jake looked at the mission parameters with concern.
"Sarah, this is way beyond anything we've attempted."
Landing on an unimproved highway in the middle of enemy territory with no ground support. If something goes wrong, there's no backup plan. Sarah understood his concerns completely. The mission violated every safety protocol they had learned, and the risks were enormous. But she also knew that Dr. Chen would die without their intervention, along with potentially dozens of patients who needed his surgical skills. "How many people are we talking about evacuating?" she asked. 12 total. Dr. Chen, 4 other medical personnel, 6 journalists, and a Red Cross coordinator. Dr. Chen is critical and needs immediate cardiac surgery. The others are healthy but trapped and requesting evacuation. Sarah made her decision. "We'll take the mission. But we go in fast, load quickly, and get out immediately. No delays, no complications." The flight to Mikhailovsk took place at dawn, when visibility was good but ground fog provided some concealment from enemy observers. Sarah flew at low altitude to avoid radar detection, following river valleys and using terrain features to mask their approach. As they neared the landing site, Sarah could see why the mission was so dangerous. The highway cut through dense forest with hills rising on both sides that could conceal enemy positions. There were no visible signs of friendly forces, and the area looked completely deserted. "I don't see any ground signals or markers," Jake observed, scanning the highway through binoculars. "The hospital staff said they would mark the landing zone with white sheets," Sarah replied, beginning her approach to the highway. "There, I can see white fabric laid out in an X pattern about halfway down the straight section." Sarah lined up her approach with the highway, treating it like a narrow runway. The surface appeared to be asphalt in reasonable condition, but there was no way to know about potholes, debris, or other hazards until they were on the ground. The landing was surprisingly smooth. The highway surface was better than expected, and Sarah was able to bring the aircraft to a stop well short of the curve at the far end. But as soon as they were on the ground, she kept the engines running at idle power in case they needed to depart quickly. A small group of people emerged from the tree line, moving cautiously toward the aircraft. Sarah could see one man being supported by 2 others, obviously Dr. Chen, who appeared to be conscious but in severe distress. Jake opened the cabin door and immediately began assessing Dr. Chen's condition. The surgeon was pale and sweating, showing classic signs of a heart attack. His pulse was irregular, and he was experiencing chest pain and shortness of breath. "We need to get him to a cardiac center immediately," Jake announced. "He's having a major coronary event and needs intervention within the next few hours." As Jake and the medical personnel loaded Dr. Chen into the aircraft, the other evacuees quickly boarded. The journalists looked relieved but nervous, clearly understanding the danger they were all in. The Red Cross coordinator briefed Sarah on the security situation. "The rebel commander has guaranteed safe passage for this evacuation, but his troops are trigger-happy and communications aren't perfect. We need to depart as soon as possible before someone makes a mistake." Sarah was conducting her pre-takeoff checks when she heard the sound that every pilot fears in a combat zone. The distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds. The first explosion hit about 200 yards away, sending up a column of dirt and smoke. "Everyone get down," shouted one of the journalists as more explosions
began erupting around the
highway. Sarah realized that either the ceasefire had broken down or someone hadn't gotten the message about the humanitarian evacuation. Either way, they were now under active enemy fire with a critically ill patient and 11 other people depending on her to get them out alive. "Jake, get everyone secured immediately," Sarah called as she advanced the throttles. "We're taking off right now." The second mortar round hit closer, and Sarah could hear shrapnel pinging off the aircraft's fuselage. Dr. Chen was strapped to a stretcher in the cabin, unconscious and connected to portable life support equipment that Jake was frantically trying to protect from the explosions. Sarah released the brakes and began her takeoff roll down the highway as mortar rounds continued to explode on both sides of the aircraft. The takeoff distance seemed endless, with explosions getting closer and more accurate as the enemy gunners adjusted their aim. At 60 knots, another mortar round exploded directly beside the highway, less than 30 yards from the aircraft. The blast wave hit them like a giant fist, lifting the left wing and nearly causing the aircraft to lose control. Sarah fought the controls desperately, using every ounce of her strength to keep the aircraft tracking straight down the highway. Finally, at 75 knots, the aircraft lifted off the highway and began climbing away from the hell below. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from small arms fire in the forest, and she heard the distinctive crack of bullets passing close to the aircraft. But they were airborne and climbing, with 12 lives depending on her flying skills to get them to safety. Dr. Chen was fighting for his life in the cabin while Jake worked to stabilize him with limited medical equipment and no assistance. Budapest Control. Red Cross Medical 847 declaring medical emergency. "We have a critical cardiac patient requiring immediate transport to the nearest cardiac surgery facility. We also took enemy fire during takeoff and need to inspect the aircraft for damage." Red Cross Medical 847 cleared direct to Vienna International Airport. "They have a cardiac surgery team standing by. Emergency services will inspect your aircraft upon arrival." During the flight to Vienna, Jake worked frantically to keep Dr. Chen alive. The surgeon had suffered a massive heart attack and was going into cardiac arrest multiple times during the flight. Jake had to perform CPR twice while Sarah flew through turbulent weather, making his medical interventions even more challenging. "Sarah, he's not going to make it unless we get to Vienna in the next 20 minutes, Jake reported. "I'm losing him back here." Sarah pushed the aircraft beyond its normal operating limits, flying at maximum speed while coordinating with Austrian air traffic control for the fastest possible approach and landing. Every minute counted, and she knew that Dr. Chen's life hung in the balance. They landed in Vienna 38 minutes after takeoff from the highway in Mikhailovsk. Austrian medical teams were waiting with a cardiac surgery crew, and Dr. Chen was rushed directly from the aircraft to the operating room. The post-flight inspection revealed that the aircraft had taken multiple hits from shell fragments and small arms fire. Several panels were punctured, hydraulic lines were damaged, and one of the navigation antennas had been completely destroyed. It was remarkable that they had remained airborne with such extensive battle damage. Sarah's first flight into Petrograd was scheduled for dawn, when visibility was good but the risk of enemy activity was supposedly lower. She and Jake took off from Budapest at 4:30 a.m., flying east toward the Valerian border as the sun began to rise over the European countryside. The transformation from peaceful Hungarian farmland to war-torn Valeria was stark and disturbing. As they crossed the border, Sarah could see columns of smoke rising from bombed villages and long lines of refugees walking along the roads with their belongings packed into carts and suitcases. Petrograd Control. This is Red Cross Medical 847, requesting approach clearance for humanitarian evacuation flight, Sarah transmitted as they neared the capital city. Red Cross Medical 847, cleared for approach runway 27. Be advised we have reports of artillery activity in the eastern sector. Recommend expedited approach and departure. Sarah could see the city ahead and it looked like something from a war movie. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, with still smoking ruins where apartment buildings had stood just days earlier. The airport itself showed obvious damage. The terminal building had several large holes in its roof, and there were bomb craters scattered around the runway area. As Sarah lined up for her approach, she noticed several military vehicles positioned around the airport perimeter. Government soldiers were manning defensive positions, and she could see the barrels of anti-aircraft guns pointed toward the rebel-controlled eastern districts. The landing was tense but routine. Sarah touched down smoothly on the damaged runway, avoiding the worst of the shell holes while maintaining her approach speed in case they needed to execute a quick go-around. Red Cross Medical 847, taxi to Hangar 3 for patient loading. Expedite ground time. We have reports of increased enemy activity, the control tower advised. Sarah taxied quickly to the designated hangar, where she could see medical personnel waiting with stretchers and equipment. The scene was heartbreaking. Dozens of wounded civilians were lying on makeshift beds, many of them children with obvious blast injuries. Jake jumped out of the aircraft as soon as Sarah shut down the engines, immediately beginning to assess the waiting patients. His medical training allowed him to quickly prioritize which patients were most critical and could survive the flight to Hungary. We've got 6 critical cases ready to go, Jake reported. 4 adults and 2 children, all with injuries requiring immediate surgery. The kids are the most urgent. One has internal bleeding from shrapnel. The other has a severe head trauma. As Jake and the Red Cross medical team loaded the patients, Sarah kept the engines running and monitored the radio frequencies for any signs of incoming attacks. She could hear sporadic gunfire in the distance, and occasionally felt the ground shake from artillery explosions somewhere in the city. Sarah, we're loaded and ready for departure, Jake announced after 23 minutes on the ground. Sarah immediately began her taxi toward the runway, eager to get her vulnerable patients away from the danger zone. But as they approached the runway threshold, the control tower transmitted an urgent warning. All aircraft, we have incoming artillery fire directed at the airport. Take cover immediately. Sarah could see the government soldiers around the airport running for their defensive positions, and she knew they had only seconds to make a critical decision. Taking off into artillery fire would be extremely dangerous, but staying on the ground made them sitting targets. Jake, hold on back there, Sarah called as she advanced the throttles to full power. We're getting out of here right now. The aircraft accelerated rapidly down the runway as Sarah heard the distinctive whistle of incoming artillery shells. The first explosion hit about 300 yards to their left, sending up a column of dirt and debris. The second shell landed closer, and Sarah could feel the concussion wave rock the aircraft. At liftoff speed, Sarah pulled back on the controls, and the heavily loaded aircraft struggled into the air. As they climbed away from the airport, she could see more explosions erupting around the runway behind them. Petrograd Control, Red Cross Medical 847 is airborne with 6 critical patients. Thanks for the warning. Red Cross Medical 847, glad you got out safely. The airport is temporarily closed due to the artillery barrage. Safe flight to Budapest. During the flight back to Hungary, Jake worked frantically to stabilize his patients. The 2 children were in particularly critical condition, and he had to administer emergency medications and monitor their vital signs continuously. How are they doing back there? Sarah asked, keeping her voice calm despite her own stress from the dramatic takeoff. The head trauma patient is stable but critical. The child with internal bleeding is getting worse. We need to get to Budapest as fast as possible. Sarah pushed the aircraft to its maximum cruise speed while coordinating with Hungarian air traffic control for priority handling. The child with internal bleeding was fading fast, and every minute counted. They landed in Budapest 58 minutes after takeoff from Petrograd. Hungarian medical teams were waiting at the airport and immediately transported all 6 patients to nearby hospitals. Later that evening, Jake received word that all 6 patients had survived their surgeries and were expected to recover fully. 2 more lives saved because you were willing to take off into that artillery barrage, Jake told Sarah as they prepared their aircraft for the next morning's mission. We couldn't have left them there, Sarah replied simply. They were counting on us. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah and Jake flew 12 more evacuation missions into Petrograd. Each flight brought its own dangers and challenges. They flew through thunderstorms, dodged artillery fire, and landed on runways that deteriorated a little more with each passing day. The most harrowing mission came on their 8th day in Europe. They had just loaded 7 patients, including a pregnant woman in premature labor, when rebel forces launched a major offensive against the airport. Sarah was taxiing for takeoff when explosions began erupting all around the runway. Red Cross Medical 847, abort takeoff immediately. We are under heavy attack, the control tower shouted over the radio, but Sarah could see that returning to the hangar would trap them in the middle of the bombardment. The pregnant woman was screaming in pain, and Jake was shouting that she was about to deliver her baby during the artillery attack. In that moment, Sarah made the most dangerous decision of her flying career. Instead of aborting the takeoff, she continued accelerating down the runway as explosions erupted on both sides of the aircraft. Shell fragments pinged off the fuselage, and the aircraft shook violently from nearby concussions. At the moment of liftoff, a shell exploded directly beside the runway, less than 50 yards from the aircraft. The blast wave caught the aircraft just as it became airborne, causing it to roll violently to the left. Sarah fought the controls desperately, using every ounce of her skill and experience to keep the damaged aircraft flying. "Sarah, we've lost hydraulic pressure," Jake shouted from the back. "The controls are getting sluggish." Sarah could feel the aircraft becoming more difficult to control as they climbed away from the airport. The hydraulic system, which powered the flight controls, had obviously been damaged by shell fragments. Flying the aircraft was now requiring enormous physical effort, and she wasn't sure how long she could maintain control. Budapest Control, Red Cross Medical 847 declaring emergency. "We have hydraulic system damage and flight control problems. Requesting immediate priority clearance for landing." Red Cross Medical 847, cleared direct Budapest Airport. Emergency services standing by. "What is your status?" "Aircraft is controllable but difficult. We have 7 critical patients on board, including a woman in active labor. We need medical teams standing by for immediate transport." During the agonizing 50-minute flight back to Budapest, Sarah fought continuously to keep the aircraft under control. Her arms ached from the physical effort required to move the flight controls, and sweat was pouring down her face despite the cool temperature. Meanwhile, Jake was dealing with his own emergency in the passenger cabin. The pregnant woman had gone into full labor during the artillery attack, and he was forced to deliver her baby at 8,000 feet with explosions still echoing in their ears from the receding battleground. "Sarah, we've got a healthy baby girl back here," Jake announced as they approached Budapest. "Both mother and baby are stable, but they need immediate medical attention after landing." Sarah's emergency landing in Budapest was the most technically demanding flying of her career. With limited hydraulic pressure, the aircraft required tremendous physical strength to control, especially during the approach and landing phases. She had to use manual reversion techniques that she had only practiced in flight simulators. The aircraft touched down hard on the Budapest runway, bouncing twice before finally settling. Emergency vehicles immediately surrounded the aircraft as Sarah shut down the engines with shaking hands. All 7 patients survived the flight, including the newborn baby who had entered the world during an artillery bombardment. The Hungarian medical teams transported them to hospitals within minutes of landing. And once again, Jake's quick thinking and medical skills had saved lives under impossible conditions. 3 hours later, Jake found Sarah in the Vienna airport terminal, staring out the window at their damaged aircraft. "Dr. Chen made it through surgery," Jake reported. "The cardiac team said he'll make a full recovery. All 11 other passengers are fine, and the journalists are already filing their stories about the evacuation." Sarah nodded, still processing everything that had happened. "We actually pulled it off," she said quietly. "Sarah, what you did today was beyond anything I imagined possible. You landed on a highway under enemy fire, took off while under mortar attack, and flew a damaged aircraft with a dying patient to safety. You saved 12 lives through pure skill and courage." Later that evening, Sarah received a call from Tom Bradley at Life Flight. "Sarah, the whole world is talking about what you and Jake did today," he said. "CNN is running the story of Dr. Chen's rescue, and the aviation community is calling it one of the most heroic flights in civilian aviation history." "We were just doing our job," Sarah replied. "No, you were doing something far beyond anyone's job description. You risked everything to save people you'd never met, in conditions that would have defeated most military pilots. You've proven that the best pilots aren't defined by their backgrounds or training. They're defined by their courage and commitment to helping others." 6 months later, Sarah received the International Aviation Safety Award for her actions during the Valerian humanitarian mission. At the award ceremony, she was introduced by Captain David Walsh, the airline pilot who had once dismissed her capabilities. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to introduce someone who has redefined what it means to be a professional pilot." Sarah Martinez didn't follow the traditional path to the cockpit, but she has proven that courage, skill, and dedication matter more than any credentials or background. She represents the very best of our profession. As Sarah accepted the award, she thought about her journey from serving coffee at 30,000 feet to saving lives in war zones. The critics had scoffed at her airline background, but when lives were on the line, none of that mattered. She had found her calling in the skies, and no amount of skepticism could diminish what she had accomplished. "Thank you," she said to the audience of aviation professionals. "This award belongs to every pilot who chooses service over personal glory, who takes calculated risks to help others, and who proves that the best aviators are defined not by where they came from, but by what they're willing to do when people need help."